Alright guys, welcome back to What the Franchise, and today we're going to be looking at something that I feel like kind of epitomizes the What the Franchise mantra, and that is going to be game prep tendency data. Now this is something that I feel like is a perfect example of how CFM has pretty much gotten to the state that it's currently in, because it's something that looks really nice on the surface, but when you dive in deeper you find out that there's not really much there, and that the feature itself isn't really necessarily what it's been advertised to be. But first off, let's take a look at the official CFM blog for Madden 17 when game planning was first introduced. For game planning, it says, know your opponent's tendencies every week, then pick the right drills to attack and counter those tendencies in-game. And then moving down to the tendency section, it says, the offensive and defensive tendencies of your opponent are tracked week to week, giving you the information you need when selecting your game plan. Does your opponent bring the blitz, or does he or she play man or zone coverage? It will be easy to tell with the tendency information. Now, I want you to keep those two descriptions in mind because we're going to come back to those a little bit throughout this as well. But that sounds really good, and this was the biggest thing that I was excited for in a pretty lackluster year for CFM features for Madden 17, because the thought and the premise behind it I think is great. Game planning is a huge part of football, and the thought of having something where you have to factor in your opponent's tendencies and even more so their strengths and weaknesses is, like I said, it's a great premise and really should be a fundamental part of any football franchise mode. Unfortunately though, you're going to see how this feature has ended up here and why it's not exactly what it was advertised to be. So first things first, we're going to look at how this affects solo franchise players, and the short answer is that it doesn't. So just looking here, you're going to notice that the Chargers game planning data with the run to pass ratio at 64% and 36%. Looking to the defensive side, you're going to see 29% zone blitz, 22% cover 3, and 15% cover 1. But now we're going to simulate to the next meeting later in the season with the Chargers, and as you're going to see, the numbers haven't changed at all and are still exactly the same. So the next step that I decided to take there was to simulate 10 years into the future and see what happened there. So after we simulate that 10 years into CFM, we're now in 2027. The Chargers coach is now Ron Rivera, so their coach is completely different. We're 10 years past where we originally were, and you might think things have changed, but as you're going to see, the data is still exactly the same as it was at the beginning. So the reality here is that the data is essentially meaningless if you're playing a solo franchise or a solo offline franchise. It doesn't even do something as simple as looking at the stats and pulling from that to get the correct run to pass ratios. It doesn't update, it doesn't change, it's pretty much useless. And the entire premise of game planning was to, quote, know your opponent's tendencies every week and then pick the right drills to attack and counter those tendencies in game. But what happens here is that the data that is given to you is essentially made up, and it's not really based on anything that the team you're playing may or may not do. So that's pretty straightforward, but once we get into the other side of things, which is how this works in a 32-team CFM or just a CFM with other users online, is where things get a little bit more weird. Initially, I tested this in an offline franchise just because it's easier to check the data by creating another character rather than using a separate gamer tag and logging out and logging back in. And this is the way I tested it in Madden 17, so that's what I plan to do here as well. But anyways, I thought I was going to initially have to scrap this video because I thought things had changed, because when I tested it, I was getting different results than I had been getting before in both Madden 17 and Madden 18. But what I ended up finding out was that the reasoning behind that was, for whatever reason, data was only being tracked in these offline franchise games if I was using play the moment to play offense or defense, which is how I had always tested it before. But after playing a full game, it appeared that the data was being tracked correctly, but it wasn't until I went back and looked at it that I found out that the data wasn't actually being tracked at all, and the numbers that I was seeing were actually the same static numbers that you'd get in a solo offline franchise, which in the end I guess really isn't all that surprising. It's just weird that the data was being tracked and collected when I was using play the moment, but from what I tested, if I played the whole game, then no data was being collected at all. But moving on, I started up a Cloud CFM and used 2 different gamer tags to run the same test. And the good news here is that if you're in an online CFM with other users, the info does track and update as long as another user is playing the games. The bad news though is, again, that this data doesn't exactly represent what you'd think it would, and it isn't entirely useful. like I said, this was something I tested in Madden 17 after seeing this tweet from John White that stated that the tendency data given weighed first down more heavily. So what I did in Madden 17 is the same thing that you're seeing me do here in Madden 18. Basically, I start up a game and all I did was run on first down and then throw on every other down because I wanted to see how heavily first downs were being weighed. I did the same thing on defense where basically I ran cover 1 on every first down and then cover 3 on every other down. But after the first game, you're going to see that it says that I run 100% of the time, meaning that first downs weren't being weighed more heavily. They were actually the only thing being tracked at all. So the next step was to see what had happened after another game was played. And for the second game, I essentially reversed the process. So instead of running on first down, I threw passes on every first down and ran on every other down. And then on defense, I ran cover 3 on every first down and cover 1 on every other down. And I wanted to see how this would end up affecting the data. And as you can see, after that game was played, when we look at the data, you see that it's basically flipped, and now it says that I pass 100% of the time, and that I'm playing cover 3 100% of the time. So basically the data that is tracked and that you'll get for other users within your CFM is entirely based around first down plays from the previous game. So if you're playing a team in week 17, the data that you're going to be seeing within that game planning section is entirely based around only the first down plays that that person ran in that previous week 16 game. Everything before that isn't taken into account and isn't considered at all. And another thing that I came across was that in a couple of the times that I tested this, there were times where the defensive data wasn't being tracked at all. I was just getting those same static numbers as well, and I'm not really sure what was causing that or how common that actually is, but that was just another issue that popped up as well. But just looking at the data, I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb and saying that the data provided isn't entirely useful. It's like if you were devising a game plan against a pitcher in baseball and the only data that you had was based on the first pitch of every at-bat from the last game that he pitched. In reality, that's just a fraction of the entire picture, and as you can see by these two examples, it doesn't do a good job at conveying how your opponent might play because there's no proper context given to that data, and because that data is such a small portion of the overall sample. So just going back to the CFM blog and the statement of the offensive and defensive tendencies of your opponent are tracked week to week, giving you the information you need when selecting your game plan. Does your opponent bring the blitz, or does he or she play man or zone coverage? It will be easy to tell with the tendency information. So technically that's not false. It does do that, albeit in potentially the most shallow way possible, and I'm not even sure if referring to it as tendency information would be accurate, being that it's only based on one particular situation from one game, and I don't feel like that's ever going to be close to enough information to really classify something as being a tendency. So you've got the blog saying that, and then there's tweets like this from the devs saying that it weighs first downs more heavily, or that it's based on the last 100 offensive snaps or so. And you've got all this information that's kind of conflicting and saying that it does this or that, but the reality seems to be that it doesn't really do any of these things, and that's pretty much what I mean by saying that this feature kind of epitomizes the what the franchise mantra. But enough about that. Getting into how to approve it, I think, is pretty simple. For the offline player or for the solo franchise player, that data needs to be pulled from something so that it can be more relevant to the user, whether it be pulling it from the actual stats within the game to at least make sure that the run to pass ratios are accurate. I think the better way to do it would be pulling information from the playbooks or whatever is used to determine how the CPU calls its plays. I think that would probably be best, because it wouldn't necessarily be accurate but when compared to the stats, but it would be most useful in terms of the user and letting them know what the opponent is most likely to do, which is the entire premise of game planning as well. As for the online CFM though, the collection of data has to become more significant. At the very least, it has to take into consideration more than just one game, and hopefully more than just first down plays. Ideally, I think it should take into consideration pretty much every play ran on offense or defense, so that you can get more of a full scope of the opponent that you're playing and are put in the best position to counter your opponent and counter their tendencies and strengths and weaknesses as well. If that's not possible, then you have to at least help the user out and give them some more context to the information that they're getting, and let them know that it's based on, or that it's only based on 1st and 10 situations, and that most of what's happening there isn't being represented. But breaking things down into individual situations, I think, would be even better. It would be a lot more to take in, but it gives you, like I said, more context and more of a full scope of the opponent you're playing, rather than this very limited picture, and it would allow you to truly see the tendencies of your opponent that are formed over multiple situations and multiple games rather than just one. But no matter what you do, really, it's going to be an improvement over what is currently in place. I'm going to wrap it up here, though. Hopefully this wasn't too confusing and I was able to explain how little is actually going on with this feature clearly. But like I said, that's going to do it for now. My next Beyond the Blueprint video is going to be, I think, about player scouting, since I just talked about that in my last What the Franchise video. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and as always, thanks for watching.